Author's Press.
Hey, it's Benji Cole, son of Al Cole from CBS Radio and host of People of Distinction, the talk that gives an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and successful people on the planet. And on the line with us today, we have Thomas Rylen. And we're going to be discussing his amazing book, Hyperreligiosity to Grace, a true story. But people, get this. If you want to gather everything that Thomas has in store, head directly to his personal site. Okay, and that's tomrylen.com. That's TOMRYLEN. There you'll find more information on Thomas himself, more information on this fantastic narrative, Hyperreligiosity to Grace, as well as find hyperlinks set up to take you to the purchasing pages. So one more time, that's tomrylen.com. And I will say, Thomas was brought to our network, People of Distinction, today by some of the best publishers in the business, Authors Press. So if you or anyone you know have a book that they'd like moved, people, give yourself the best gift you could possibly give. Contact Authors Press and have their wonderful team move it for you. You can find out more information on them at authorspress.com. And listen, it is an absolute pleasure to have Thomas here on the line. He is absolutely the truest embodiment of a person of distinction, and I want to welcome him to the network now. Tom, first and foremost, welcome to People of Distinction, man, and thank you very much for being a guest. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Benji. Appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Listen, the pleasure is all ours, Thomas, and we're really looking forward to this discussion and really looking forward to picking up the book and learning directly from you. And again, I know this is only one person's perspective, so by no means is this a blanket statement for the entire community and a blanket statement for the entire situation of mental health and mental illness. But I think it's so valuable what you've done here. And Tom, before we go into the book, I want to learn a little bit more about your background. Let's start there. Please tell us a little bit more about yourself. And I know that this is a memoir, so it may tie into the book. And if it does, not a problem whatsoever. But let's start there. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, Thomas.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, I'm from Spring, Texas. I'm raised the youngest of 5. I went to the University of Texas as I got older. Always liked doing things with math and putting things together, and went into civil engineering. And after that, I was fortunate enough to get a position in Galveston, Texas at the Army Corps of Engineers. And I worked there for about 7 years. And in the book, I talk about while I'm there, I'm starting to have these little red flags of things that I didn't know at the time were an indicator that I probably should have sought out some kind of help. And so the book lays that out. It starts out with little red flags, and then it goes ultimately into a mental institution after losing a career. But, and not to deviate from, growing up, and just had a really good going back, I had a really good upbringing, have really good parents. They're in their 80s today. I'm always over there on weekends, helping them out and love them dearly. Mm-hmm. And, looking at the mental illness that I went through, and in a lot of ways, I'm pretty much 99% better, but life is also about maintenance, so we should never be arrogant about it. But one thing about the condition I went through, a lot of times, even some family members have read the book, and I always tell them, hey, don't feel guilty. There's a lot of times when somebody has a mental condition, I can't speak for everybody, so anybody listening, I just want you to know I'm willing to hear your story. But a lot of times with mental illnesses, we don't have insight into what's going on. And so a lot of times even people's most well-meaning help just can't seem to break through. I mean, there's things people can do to be aware of it, but sometimes it takes time to even get a deeper insight into what's going on, even when you have a condition. I mean, I had a condition, got diagnosed at a hospital, and it took about 3 years before I even just honestly admit, okay, there's more than just these symptoms here. What's going on? And behind I believe, I'm not a psychologist. I do follow some different psychologists. I follow I'm not trying to promote somebody, but I follow Carolyn Leaf out of Australia, actually she's out of Dallas. But behind every condition, one thing I've noticed is that there's even though there's these diagnoses, there's still a root cause in our thinking. There's something that we're believing. It all starts with believing the wrong information, and then we build a life off that information, and it leads to toxic living and toxic thinking. And whether we have a diagnosis or not, we all have challenges, all of us. And I believe the book's beneficial to just show somebody's experience, show that you can fight whatever you're facing, and you're not alone. And so I released the book. I was already, I'm going to say about 95% healed when I sent the book to the publisher, because healing is a process. It doesn't all just happen overnight. I'm not total. I mean, nobody's ever totally healed in this life, because we deal with a lot of issues and our mind is very complex. But yeah, I've even learned some new things in the last several years, some of the reasons why I thought the way I did, and I've written about that. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself in this question, but I've started to write about that in the second book. We can touch on that later if that's a topic of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Thomas, thank you very much for all the information that you've relayed, man, and so many wonderful points that you bring up. I mean, listen, life is filled with challenges, people. I think after a certain point, after a certain age, you just kind of understand that's part of the game, right? And as much as we'd like to avoid it, you can't, right? And there's always more that happens. You get past one test and there's another. So, Thomas, you're talking about how you're never fully healed. Well, listen, that's life. We can relate to that. I get that. I relate to that. And I think that's where a lot of the power of your book lies, right? Is in that relatability, because whether or not you are someone, and I'm talking, of course, about a generalized you, not you specifically, Thomas, but whether or not you are someone that has dealt with a mental illness condition, you understand challenges, you understand adversity, and you understand how that can turn life upside down depending on what those challenges may be. So life is a marathon. By no means is it a sprint, and you're just kind of moving on to the next one. And I love the fact that you started there, because again, we're formulating a bridge here with the audience already, and I can see it happening right before my eyes. Thomas, I want to go into your title, because there's something about it that I find absolutely enticing, right? Hyperreligiosity to grace. Now, yeah, there's something about that, again, that just stops you in your track. And of course, as an author, that's what you're wanting, right? You're wanting your potential readers sifting through titles, and then boom, they come across yours, and they just have to view it and look into it to explore further. So on that note, you hit the nail on the head, right? Thomas, talk to us about that title, the connection that it has to the narrative, and why you chose it to be the representation for your book.
Yeah, well, hyperreligiosity, I will say I'm not an expert on this. There's actually, I think that's a psychological term also used in some circles. I used it more of how it relates to me and my belief system, and how it led to certain ways of thinking that are related to theology and God that were very toxic, just misappropriated. But it's also a term I've heard used. I didn't plan on saying this, but when I was in the institution, I believe it was the second time, there was a Russian psychiatrist, and she would throw that word at me. She'd say, "You're being hyper-religious." That's the first time I heard it. And so later, a couple years later, I might be getting into the intention behind the book, but I sat down to write a book about some of these experiences. And initially, I was going to write, I'll be honest, I was going to write a fiction, but it was based on my life, and bring in some other characters and just kind of make it interesting. But as I'm writing it, I didn't get off my own script. And as I'm going through it, I'm like, you know what, I'll just keep this to me. After about 20 to 30% of the way through, I decided, I'm just going to make this a memoir. But I hadn't really decided where I was going with it, other than let's just talk about what happened. And this is about a 10-year period. And ultimately, because of my faith, I decided to bring in the grace aspect towards the end, because when you use the word hyper-religiosity, you can almost be an excuse to dog on, faith circles and say, yeah, it's all just a bunch of baloney. Just look at this guy. And I didn't want that to be the ultimate message, that came out of it, because there still is I believe there's a genuine religion. Most people don't use the word religion, but there's a genuine faith I believe in. And I started to discover more of that, though I know we're covering the health aspect of it. So I did have some, so even though I call it hyperreligiosity, I believe, like I said earlier, when you have the wrong information in your mind, whether it's religious information or whatever it is, it's ultimately, if you build your life on that, it's going to lead to dysfunction. And so it led to dysfunction in my life. And again, whether it's natural knowledge or how you study the Bible, if you don't get a hold of it correctly, it's going to lead to areas of misunderstanding. If you live those areas out, it might lead you down a really dark path. I'm not trying to be negative. This book is about positivity and about coming back and just reevaluating. Maybe we'll get more into that later. I forgot your original question. Oh, the title, Hyperreligiosity, Grace. So, yeah, I was birthed out of kind of hearing that buzzword in an institution. And I'll be honest, I took advantage of it. And I said, that's a very unique word, and it does kind of hit my condition to a T. Oh, and what I was going to say is that some conditions came out of that. Some of my I'll call it bad theology that I had, led to some of these other diagnoses. I ended up getting a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and I had a diagnosis of OCD. And it led to that because it was, I'd have these ideas that God was telling me to do things that just weren't real, and they weren't realistic. They were just putting me under pressure, but I thought that was the real God demanding me do these things. And I kind of had a twisted view of God. I mean, I still loved God and I still believed he was loving, but I didn't really understand how to receive that love. I know we're getting a little bit at the faith side, but it did lead to the schizophrenic diagnosis. And I could talk a lot about that, but schizophrenia just means you're split in your mind. And one thing I think did help me is at some point I started kicking back in my own hyperreligiosity. You'll see that in the book where I start saying, no, I'm going in this other direction. And so I'm kind of fighting myself throughout the journey. Part of me is like, no, that's not right. That's not healthy. And then the other part of me is like, but if it be God's will, let's do it. And it was an interesting battle. And I think that goes back to the underlying message another underlying message is don't give up. But I realized that's easier said than done, because I reached a point where I didn't feel like I could go forward. And so that's also where, even once if you do give up, just know that there can be hope again. So it's kind of both, like fight the fight, but also know you can regain hope, and don't beat yourself up for not being perfect.
There you have it. People, again, we're here on the line with Thomas Rylen. We're discussing his amazing book, Hyperreligiosity to Grace, a true story. It's available for purchase through any online book reseller, but make sure you head on over to tomrylen.com to gather everything that he has in store. Thomas, next question that I wanted to go into, and I believe we've already started to cover it, but I do think it's important to go a little bit more in depth with it when we're talking about inspiration. Now, there's a few things here. First and foremost, I want to take a moment to commend you on what you've done here. Now, I know you're not looking for praise, so let me put that out there first and foremost. But people, can we just take a second to acknowledge the bravery and the courage that it takes? Because speaking from my own experience, I'm sure a lot of you out there can relate, but there are some times that it's hard for me to look into the mirror at myself and acknowledge certain things about myself that I may not necessarily like, or that I'd like to hide or get rid of. But then to take it a step further and to construct this literary window of sorts for others to be able to peer inside and see those blemishes and see those things about ourselves that otherwise, like I said, for me, there's certain things I don't even want to acknowledge myself, let alone allow other people to see. Now, I can assume why you did that. I can assume, of course, the benefit that people will have once they pick up your book. But you know what happens when you assume, Thomas, so I'm not going to do that to you. I have you here on the line, man. I'm going directly to the source. Talk to us about your inspiration behind writing this book and why you felt compelled to do so.
Sure. So, like I said earlier, it kind of evolved. It started out initially with me just wanting to write it, and maybe that's the wrong motive. I'll be honest, the original motive probably wasn't pure, even though it was, I'm going to write a good story. Mm-hmm. And I actually got about 80% of the way through, and I was probably about 2 years ago, I was kind of facing another challenge. I'm being very honest on this program. It wasn't like the level in my book. It wasn't like I was going back to my old self, but it was enough for me to say, I'm a little frustrated that I've learned these lessons. And that's the thing with life. You're going to have to revisit what you learn and what you apply in your life. We're always going forward, but it doesn't mean you're not going to face another challenge in the future.
Yeah.
And so that's the power of documenting things and going back and say, no, this is what you know. And so I kind of got inspired to wrap it up about 2 years ago. And I was going through another weird challenge. It wasn't like anything in the book, but my mind certainly wasn't going to places I appreciated. I knew that it was going back in a direction I didn't think was right. And I've had ongoing therapy, and I'll just be real honest on this program. Even though I don't need medicine to date, but the fact that I've been on medicine for about 6 or 7 years, there's a physiological response if you just jump right off of it. So I've been working with my psychiatrists, and we've been tapering down over the last 3 to 5 years. Well, more recently than that, because you can taper down pretty quickly. But we've been tapering down in the last couple of years. And then, of course, that little episode I had about 2 years ago as I was wrapping the book up, they kind of stopped the taper, and then I've gotten back on it recently. So, yeah, my goal ultimately is to be off of that. Do I think I need it psychologically? I think I have so many tools right now, and I've kind of cleared my mind in a lot of ways that more or less the chemicals are just, they have a kind of a physiological effect on your body, where if you don't have them, you might feel drained, or you might, but my mind kind of knows what to do now. But so the inspiration was, I was having another battle, and I'm the kind of person that goes back to my faith. It's like when you're faced with something, you've got a choice. You go forward and you take the risk. You take the risk of trying to succeed, or you just sit back and you just let yourself be comfortable and worried. And, it was more like, I'm going to make the declaration to the world and to myself that I'm going to keep going. And that's, I really didn't think I would admit that on this program, but that's because, like I said earlier, healing is more of it's going up over time, but it does kind of move up and down like a stock. That's kind of a silly analogy, and so you got to understand that you're solving problems. It can be 2 to 3 steps forward, and then every once in a while you take 4 steps back, but generally you're taking those 2 to 3 steps forward, and you're moving in the right direction. And sometimes you have to take risks. And the risk is I'm going to get better. I'm going to stand on my faith. There was a risk in putting this story out to the world. There was a slightly selfish risk, or slightly selfish motive was, I know this is going to sound funny as an author, but I have this philosophy as an author: write a book that you would want to have on your own shelf. And so the second book, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. The second book covers more of those life strategies that I learned. And I wanted to release that to the world. It's coming out in 8 to 12 months. But it's kind of these what I believe are, I'm not going to say I'm the expert. You can judge it for yourself. But what I believe for my life are timeless principles that will keep me from staying back in that other life. And so I kind of had to, I'm the same Thomas that experienced all that 10 years ago, but I'm also Thomas that has a lot of new tools and a lot of new ways of looking at life. And so you kind of you keep what you had, but you evolve so much that what you used to have isn't going to affect you in a negative way anymore.
I love it. Thomas, I love this, man. I absolutely love what you're talking about. And again, so many of the things that you're saying is relatable, man. This is life. This is life, man. Listen, yeah. I may not have a diagnosis, but I'm telling you, I can relate. Okay. I can relate, Thomas. Listen, last couple of questions here as we start to close out of this fantastic interview, because people, like I said, we're only scratching the surface here today. If you want to gather everything, TomRylen.com is where you have to go. Thomas, who would you say is your intended audience with this book? And a subpart question to that, what is the main message that you hope that they receive from it?
It's pretty much anybody, because I know that sounds, well, it's pretty much anybody, because we all face challenges. Mm-hmm. I can pick up anybody's story and find something from it. And, it's a story about not giving up, and that no matter how bad it looks, you know, you lose your career, you get a diagnosis. That's another one. You know, I finally accepted that. Who cares? You know, I have a diagnosis, so what?
Absolutely.
You know, when you can finally accept who you are, I mean, you're not your diagnosis, but when you can finally just own everything you are and am, good, that's good English right there, but but so when you can own it all, then there's a freedom to that. And so I don't want to be arrogant and say that my story is going to heal somebody. I think it might be a starting point for somebody to say, hey, wait a minute, that guy did that, and maybe I can change this. Mm-hmm. And so the audience I think anybody can benefit from it. I think it's certainly people that want to read about somebody else with a mental condition, maybe not like theirs, but they want to just see what that person's like. I do the same thing. I'm reading another book. I'm not trying to promote a bunch of people. I'm reading another book about this woman that went to France, and she had bipolar, and she ended up, she was in college, and she went there to study abroad, and ultimately she ended up in a mental institution. She had hyperreligiosity. So, I mean, I read other people's books and her hyperreligiosity was totally different than mine. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to make the claim that you're necessarily going to get healed by my book, but it might open your mind up to know you're not alone, and you can come back. You can come back from whatever you're going through. And then, I mean, it might be an interesting story for anybody else to read. I think I laugh at some, because I've healed from a lot of it, and I don't care if people laugh at it either, but some of those little examples in my book, I find myself laughing about how ridiculous it is. And if somebody gets that out of it, good for them. If you read my book, you're going to go on a journey. And even if you can't relate with mental illness, you're going to be like, man, I can't imagine what that was like, but you're going to get to imagine it through a 96-page novel. And I guarantee if you read it, you're not going to be I know I'm doing a little sales pitch, but you won't be disappointed just from just somebody else's journey. So I think it, like I said, it can speak to so many different audiences. It has a healing piece, but it also has what did another soul go through in life? And it's so obscure. I mean, the mental illness piece, and I don't want to get into what I was thinking in the book, but those thoughts they're absurd, but they're when you know you're free from them now, they're kind of funny.
Right.
So yeah.
Listen, Thomas, people, I could stay here. I could talk to Thomas for hours. Okay. I think the topic of conversation is that fascinating. It's that poignant. And I think it's that beneficial, you know, and one of the things that I want to touch up on here as we start to close out is amongst a plethora of gems that Thomas has dropped on us today, he said mental illness is not a title that you have to wear and carry around with you. Can we talk about how important that is? And again, he's talking about mental illness. People, I'm going to open it up to everything. No matter what it is that you're experiencing, no matter what it is that you're going through, it does not define you. It's not a title that you carry around with you for the rest of your life. Now, it may be something that you're constantly working through, but it doesn't define you. As human beings, we are multifaceted individuals. There's a lot of things happening. I'm telling you, ask my significant other, because she may look at me certain days and be like, you're a different Benji. Okay. But this is just human nature. And this is why, again, I'm telling you, people, this is a book. It's a fantastic resource that you need to add to your shelf. Because like he said, whether you've experienced mental issues or not, at the end of the day, this book is relatable for so many different reasons. From just the standpoint, as human beings, we are multifaceted. And there are different things that we deal with every single day. And it doesn't stop. That's life. I love that. And remember that whatever situation you may be dealing with, whatever title society may want to put on you, it does not define you. And again, I know this is an oversimplification for this interview, people, but this book is filled with gems. And remember, this is one person's experience. It's a spectrum in terms of the different ways mental illness can affect different people. And again, there are so many other questions that I'd love to ask Thomas and that we'd love to go into. But for the sake of the interview, we're going to close it out, okay? Because now the onus is on you. You know where you have to go. I'm going to say it for you once more. We're here on the line with Thomas Rylen. We finished discussing his amazing book, Hyperreligiosity to Grace, A True Story. It's available for purchase, but check out tomrylen.com to gather more helpful information, to get his other book the moment it becomes available. I mean, you can thank me later, okay? We'll just end it with that. A wonderful book to add to your shelf, an even better gift to add to someone else's. Head on over there today and pick up your copies. Thomas, this has been an absolute pleasure, man. Such an honor. Thank you once again for being a guest on People of Distinction.
Thank you, Benji. I enjoyed it.